Attacks in Russia, the return of terror? In the interview, Russia expert Alexander Rahr.
Mr. Rahr, how credible is the Russian domestic intelligence agency, the FSB, in blaming the so-called Black Widows for the subway attacks?
The attacks we saw recently in Moscow bear the same handwriting as similar attacks in 2000 and from 2001 to 2004. Chechen terrorists used the so-called Black Widows as instruments of death to blow up trains, buses and planes. So of course the FSB was quick to say these tactics are being repeated. But in this case, video images of these Black Widows were also released quickly, and it was possible to verify witness statements immediately.
The North Caucasus is no stranger to anarchy, violence and clan rule. Shortly after the subway attacks, 2 suicide bombers blew themselves up in the Russian Republic of Dagestan. Are we seeing a new wave of violence?
We've been seeing this wave of violence for some months. There have been several attacks in the Caucasus. Not so much in Chechnya as in Ingushetia and Dagestan, and also in the other 2 or 3 North Caucasus republics. State employees and a governor were the main victims of these attacks. There were also a lot of civilian deaths. I think the campaign of terror is continuing in the North Caucasus region.
Have Russian security agencies underestimated the danger that there could be more attacks in Moscow or other Russian cities?
That remains to be seen. I think they should have seen these attacks coming. The intelligence services seem to have been informed. They didn't react. And above all, they've done too little to stop the terror in the North Caucasus. That includes not just using state force against the terrorists, but also establishing a kind of stability pact for the Caucasus. Firstly, they need to establish the rule of law. The education system has to start working again. Money transferred by Moscow to these regions disappears into dark channels. Corruption is rampant.
Chechnya was always the prime example of violence. Things seemed quieter under Ramzan Kadyrov, who appears to have cleaned things up using quasi-Stalinist methods. And some reconstruction work is taking place. Is this all just a facade, or is there some substance to it?
I think Vladimir Putin and Dmitry Medvedev had no choice at the time but to install Kadyrov. What the man is doing sounds unpleasant, but the Russian police and FSB people have withdrawn. I saw that myself when I was in Chechnya a year ago. Putin and Medvedev have pursued the Chechenization of Chechnya, put everything into the hands of one clan and left it up to them. It's a fact that this clan is responding to terrorism with terrorist methods, but Russia can live with that as long as Chechnya doesn't want to leave the Federation.
We've heard both Medvedev and Putin using very martial language. But we get the impression that Medvedev is not quite as harsh as Putin. Does that tell us anything?
I think Putin has taken these attacks personally, because the first was in the metro station directly under the Lubyanka, the Secret Service headquarters, which is his power base. He is overreacting, as you've said. Medvedev also used harsh language, but he's now backtracked somewhat and redefined the direction. No new spiral of violence in the North Caucasus. He's trying to rebuild the region using economic programs and regain the trust of the population, and above all give people some hope.
Is that an implicit admission that the previous North Caucasus policy failed?
I think Russia has to learn from other nations, including what NATO and other institutions are doing to bring peace to Afghanistan. There too, force cannot successfully drive out the Taliban. You have to set up civilian reconstruction. And Russia somehow needs to learn that from the West.
Human rights are a tricky issue in Russia, and they are continuously trod on there. Medvedev has at least announced that there will be some signs of more openness. Is the latest wave of violence going to choke this?
Many experts are concerned that there will be another crackdown and that the state will become even more centralized and authoritarian. But let's wait and see. If there are no new bombings, if the terror isn't actually taken into Russian cities, as some fear, so that the state perhaps feels forced to defend itself in the ways I've described and completely forgets about democracy, if that doesn't happen, then I think Medvedev and his generation will in the end prevail with their modernization strategy. What choice does Russia have? It can't align itself with China. Russia needs Europe, needs the West. And younger people have grown up almost with one foot in the West. They want a different future. So perhaps we shouldn't be too pessimistic. But you're right. Terrorist campaigns, conflicts of the kind we've seen in Russia for 15 years, bring major problems. For example, in establishing democracy.
Should Europeans and Americans not be making greater efforts to support the Russians in a region that's so geostrategically important as the Caspian Basin, where someone like Umarov wants to set up a caliphate between the Caspian Sea and the Black Sea?
I think some Western statements that the Russians have their own problems that have nothing to do with Afghanistan or Iraq or the Middle East are wrong. Of course, it's a common problem, and I think the intelligence services need to work more closely together. That includes an exchange of information between the Russians and, for example, Israel, which has had to live with a similar terrorist problem for decades. And I think NATO also really needs to open up to Russia, not immediately admit it, but, for example, work more closely with the Collective Security Pact of the CIS, which includes Russia and the other Central Asian states, to bring peace to the whole region. We need a new stability pact for the whole region. But we've been talking about that for 10 years and nothing has happened.
Vladimir Sorokin and other human rights activists say it's clear the Russian Empire will disintegrate because it's been forced together and contradicts democracy. And the North Caucasus is a sign of that. Are they right?
I don't think they're right. The old Russian Empire collapsed twice in the last century. Once before the October Revolution, and the second time, let's say finally, in 1991, in a relatively peaceful way. I think today's Russia, in which 80% of the population are Russian, does have a kind of raison d'être, in the eyes of its population too. But the economy has to function properly. Corruption must be combated. This can't be done with old Stalinist slogans. There has to be more modern thinking. I do see major possibilities. I think that Russia in its current form, if it reaches an agreement with Islam in the North Caucasus, and especially in the largest Islamic republics of Tatarstan and Bashkortostan, has a real future. Not as a nation-state, however, but as a multinational and liberal country.
Ein multinationaler und liberal geprägter Staat.
Alexander Rahr, thank you.